Yama'i. Hello and good morning to you all. I'm Frank Lake. I work for the U.S. Forest Service in the Fire and Fuels Program down in California. Feedback? I have to make sure we coordinate our mics here. Frank Lake for the Forest Service. How do we do this, Bill? In Northwestern California there, and I work a lot with the tribes in the Northern California area.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak today. My name is Bill Tripp, and I'm the Ecological Restoration Specialist for the Karuk Tribes Department of Natural Resources. I think we're supposed to be on the next slide, actually. The Karuk territory is a very remote place within the heart of the Klamath Mountains in Northern California. I've never been to Montana, but I've heard that this country has some very remote and inspiring landscapes. I'm not really familiar with the unique practices, use resources, or correlating benefits that can be derived from indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief that is specific to these landscapes, but I'm hoping that we can relate some of our life's observations and experience to principles that can be applied in local situations. The Karuk are known as the Fix the World people. Many aspects of our culture have become essentially illegal to practice since the early 1900s. We've worked hard to maintain the knowledge needed to revitalize the bridge between our sacred principles and our managerial practices so we can once again serve our human purpose. And we can't serve this purpose alone.
Off of it all? Talk about that a little bit.
No, I'll get to it later. In the beginning, there was spirit. It was a dark place up until the Great Transformation. At this time, the many spirit people began to transform into the rocks, trees, air, water, animals, plants, insects, fire, sun, moon, stars, and all other things. Humans were also part of this transformation. In this sense, all things are relations, and we are all directly linked to one another. It was told that we were given hands to help nature along in its processes, not to work against them. We were taught by the animals how to use our hands properly to maintain this balance and to benefit only from within the range of our positive influence while leaving room for all of our relations to thrive. Under this basic premise, we can formulate local strategies to restore and maintain fire-resilient landscapes, build fire-adapted communities, and respond to fire in a way that achieves social, economic, and ecological viability. And one of the things that I see emerging that is I find to be pretty refreshing is some of the activities going on with the cohesive strategy for wildland fire management. I'm on the strategy committee working group on the technical side for the Western region. And the Phase 2 report, the Wildland Fire Leadership Council adopted a vision for the next century to safely and effectively extinguish fire when needed, use fire where allowable, and manage our natural resources, and as a nation to live with wildland fire. I think that can be interpreted quite a few different ways in different situations. So traditional ecological knowledge is maintained as a science of practice, observation, adaptation, and transference of information in a manner that can be modified yet remains consistent through intergenerational change. Frank and Ron, Reed, and I got a box published in the Ecological Society of America's Eco Bulletin on Planetary Stewardship, and we wanted to show this diagram to kind of explain some of the interrelationships there between the creator and nature on one side, then humans on the other, and then that how that knowledge kind of transfers and adapts. And if you want to explain the diagram better.
Yeah. Just little things on this. It was kind of working as a tribal descendant, but also as a research scientist and with the community. You know, we were talking about traditional knowledge and science knowledge, kind of traveling down two different paths. Sometimes, as we know, on all trails in the path of life, they come together a bit. And so I was struggling with how to conceptualize that, to be able to have a diagram to share with scientists and others and managers. And so on the left side, we have the humans or the tribe, and on the right side, we have the creator or nature, and things like our creation accounts and the beliefs of fire that's stemming from the creator's laws or natural laws. We have the ecosystem processes, the things from nature like climate and weather, other processes that go on there, disturbances. And then we have the tribal adaptive response to that and how fire is used also for gathering and hunting and fishing and other ceremonies. And then that comes together down at the tribal level to the family and even individuals. And it's based on those at those different levels, your observations and your actions. And then really what I consider, and we've talked about the consciousness or your literacy. You have to understand, you might not know everything, respect the sacred, but also be aware of what's out there in your environment and pay attention and act accordingly to that with those teachings and those guidance from the traditional law. And then it comes down to, again, coming back to the ecological conditions of the landscape and understanding that for the species, how those populations of animals or habitats are resilient and how productive they are, and then how it produces those goods and services. And then for the humans, again, that reflection and interaction of nature, being able to have adaptive responses at the community, family, and individual level. And that comes together at the bottom there in the yellow box, where you have the traditional knowledge and your adaptive management, and that's the next cycle of world renewal. And so rather than kind of in a Western approach for our community, thinking about things in a linear way, each generation, each couple of years, each year, when you fix the world, you're renewing it, but based upon those traditional teachings. And you interface your traditional practices and knowledge and natural laws and natural processes in with your adaptability as a community, as a family, and as an individual. So that's how we try to embrace those concepts and that working with nature and being also a part of nature in that sense.
The interesting thing about indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief is that it's not entirely exclusive by intent. It does retain a heightened level of exclusivity due to some continued lack of trust, history of knowledge exploitation, and absence of unanimous perception that a solid indigenous foundation is vital to fulfilling our inherent human responsibilities to our homelands. Fire is central to many indigenous cultures. In the Karuk way of life, it is both spiritual and utilitarian. It's said that the smoke carries the prayers, but the fire answers them. Indigenous populations need to revitalize their connection to the traditional territories in order to maintain their identities, and non-tribal communities should embrace a consistent relationship to find a common future that reestablishes humans as being the keepers of balance in ecosystems. So scientific ecological knowledge is an effective way of penetrating a set of singular concerns to help identify components of the social, economic, and ecological dynamics to be considered at a point in time and place. In essence, Western science can become a complementary surrogate for the observation component of TEK. Did you want to talk about that burn or something?
Yeah, just a little bit here. And working with the tribal elders and basket weavers and a local landowner and the Fire Safe Council and the tribe, and also for me as a research student at the time, looking at one burn meeting multiple objectives. On one side of it, it enhances the huckleberries, but it also rejuvenates the basket material and also increases our food for the acorn resources. So although this was around a wildland urban interface and it protected that first part of the community and along the road, It's also a nice area where the elders can come and have access with the landowner working with them. And really, this is one of the few places that were burned, and we were able to achieve these living cultural resources, but still meeting the community's needs for wildland urban interface protection and along that emergency access or road route. So. Next.
So practitioners and scientists must work together to enable effective knowledge gain and incorporate performance-based, outcome-generated information in order to effectively overcome barriers, rebuild trust, and guide modification of practice through time. This will ensure that practitioners learn from scientists and adapt as observations occur, and scientists can incorporate the cumulative observation of practitioners to strengthen their perspective. Because the people on the ground do not normally read scientific publications, the practice, observation, use, and adaptation process must remain linked at the ground level, while the scientific observation component also serves to inform improved management, policy, and administrative interaction to enable perpetuation of practice in a diverse society.
Next. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, talk more about the science and working with tribal community in our area. And really, you have to understand the past practices and the past reliance upon a fire regime and the fire conditions of the place. And for the creek area and for other tribes in Northern California, this ranged from the river all the way up into the high country and the high mountain meadows. And it depended upon everything from the ceremonies to the community and where they live, but also for the richness of the culture is exhibited there with the basket material, and down in the lower left with the deerskin dance and other ceremonies. Next. So when thinking about this, for ecological knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge and fire regimes, and for climate, really what is kind of the realm, and this again thinking for managers and for scientists to kind of frame this, there's this idea of this fire regime concept put out by Kathy Whitlock and others, and I thought about and looking at this from the flame or the actual event of that individual fire to the fire event to the fire regime. How does traditional knowledge really encompass that? And on the bottom, you have the temporal scale from seconds to days to years to decades to centuries to millennia. And then on the left scale, you have the spatial component, which is at the microsite, the local, to the landscape, or to the region. And I really feel like in doing oral history interviews and working with other elders, the traditional knowledge is applicable at a range from the observations of a single fire event, but in the context of traditional knowledge and training and going back to family use areas through time, you understand how that individual fire at that point in time or season relates to the continuum of fire use and cultural adaptations to fire through time at the regime, which can be the centuries of what you learn from your grandparents, what they learn from their grandparents in the context of that traditional family use area. That's your knowledge from the individual fire to the fire event to the fire regime across the landscape. Next. And so thinking about those traditional practices being brought forward, we have to consider the environmental diversity and then what are the tribal sociocultural adaptive responses. And climate being the main driver, and we have to look at any time that fire has been excluded from the environment and fire comes back in, learning from essentially how traditional areas that were managed with fire formerly have now had fire after a long absence. There's a lot to learn from that. And so we're thinking about fire being as a major ecological process, that it influenced that biodiversity, how the tribes responded to an area that burned, and then really the applications of scientific methods today help us understand that. And so in 2006, we had a fire. Orleans is in the on top fire progression map. Orleans is in the lower left there. And we had it burn around, actually all the way over to the other side of the mountain on the right is where Bill's family territory is at. We worked as a fire behavior assessment team, selected out areas that were of cultural importance, and then they did the fire behavior monitoring to look at before the fire, 1 day after, and 1 year after. And that was really reflective for us to look at and say, hey, this is how area, if we just have fire as a primary source being reintroduced, how it negatively or beneficially affects those important resources at these old traditional campsites. So next. Probably to talk about and consider this idea of the cultural or fire regime. There's often this natural fire regime, and for land fire and for other, they consider tribal burning as part of the natural fire regime. But really, there's some specific differences that I want to relate and talk about. The cultural fire regime is different seasons of burnings for different kinds of settings. So if your lightning ignition is in the summer to late summer, early fall, cultural burning also happens at different times of the year for specific purposes. the frequencies in which fires are set and reset over various periods of time. If you wait for lightning to do it, sometimes you might be waiting too long. So the observations of how lightning was a beneficial role in certain resources, tribal people use fire again to increase the frequency in particular areas that met their objectives. And then the corresponding intensities in which fuels can be burned. Sometimes it was better to have a creeping cool fire. Other times it was necessary to maybe have a hotter fire and burn out some brush where the conifer trees were encroaching in there. And so also the intensity was an important aspect of that cultural fire regime. Next. Specific sites that are fired and those that aren't. We know working with any tribe and for traditional areas and for family, there's favored and valued places across the landscape. And sometimes those have a higher priority in looking at how and why they would use fire in that environment or that habitat. And then also working with natural as well as artificial controls that tribal people use that affected the fire. When you would ignite at the time of day, the winds, reading the weather. There's a lot of traditional teaching that I got from my other elders and other people in our community about reading the weather, understanding the fuels, what side of the hill you're on, and then looking at those natural human fire breaks. And for our area, trails were an important source for understanding how fire was ignited from or where fires would stop. And then the last part I added to this concept was the ignition patterns. More and more as I talk to elders and other people, they say, we used to burn this way. The managers aren't burning it that way. They burn it from the bottom and the torch is hot. We'd back it down from the top. Just even your ignition pattern can have the legacy of many different effects on the landscape, and I think that's one important way that traditional knowledge can be incorporated into contemporary fire use. Next. So all these different things come together to really affect the fire-induced ecological goods and services, which is what we need, but still within the framework of the overarching climate or the biophysical conditions of that landscape. Next. In thinking about fire effects on cultural resources, often managers think of cultural resources as artifacts or heritage sites or things of the past that need to be kind of flagged and avoided or protected. But for many tribes, it's living cultural resources that make the difference. To perpetuate the culture, you need to have fire used in very particular and very important ways in different areas of the landscape. And so thinking about first order fire effects could be the physical alteration of it. The secondary effects are what happens after the fire is burned. And then developed this concept called third order fire effects, which looks at the tangible or intangible and how those relate to either affecting the area, the site, the object, maybe it's an artifact or a particular rock prayer seat, or even your state of mind. Often we know that psychologically or even with our spiritual views, that when some places is negatively or even beneficially changed by fire, that relates a lot to how you feel about the place. And so really to think about those direct and indirect impacts and those different factors to consider. And so an example here for these third order fire effects, which are the socio-cultural responses to environmental conditions created by the first and second order, we have the time that the fire burned at hazel bush. The secondary effects are that it sprouted. You peel those basket sticks to make the basket, or in the case of bear grass, you need to have that lightning burn that area or tribal people burn that area to be able to make that one basket cap that's used in the ceremonies or to distinguish women's status in the community. And Kevin Ryan and others for this GTR, General Technical Report on Fire Effects on Cultural Resources, had incorporated this third order concept. And then to look at that, a little more applicability here when we're thinking about fire impacts to cultural resources, it might actually be the site. And in this case, with the little photo on the top right, there was this big pine tree that was considered a life tree that was along one of the trails between sacred sites, and this was a sacred site. And at the time, that was put as the fire contingency line, and we're saying, well, you got to protect this area. And archaeologists saying, well, we didn't find any artifacts, so how can you tell us that's a sacred tree? It wasn't until they burned out that then you revealed the river rock way high up on the ridge right by this tree. And so sometimes, again, it's that idea of if you don't see it, but tribal knowledge and tribal people are telling you that that's a sacred area and that there's other important resources there, then you have to think about certain point protection or certain mitigation strategies and looking really at that broader concept of what fire effects are on cultural resources. For those families that come back to this area to hunt and to see this degraded that way because of the fire management consequences, that really affects both the tangible and intangible aspects of it. So that's just a broader way to be thinking about how knowledge is incorporated in and thinking about cultural resources. And then also, for a given site, we know that there's potentially, based on the frequency of fire and the seasonality and your resource objectives, like this top example shows kind of the lightning regime, how it affects the conifers and the hardwoods and the forbs and the grasses and the understory diversity The middle example shows maybe under indigenous fire management for California, increased frequency led to more oaks and more pines and more grasses and forbs, which are your medicines, your foods, your other materials. And then the bottom example is that same site with the absence of fire, basically increase in fuel loading, and it's a more hazardous situation and the loss of those living cultural resources. And so really how we incorporate science and traditional knowledge basically leaves a legacy for that site for how it serves ecological as well as cultural or societal roles. Next. Without getting into too many very specific examples, each tribe in each area had various reasons why they used fire. And it could be for hunting, it could be for crop management, for reducing pest, range improvement or forage, fireproofing areas, tree falling or fuel wood was an important aspect of that, clearing areas for travel, clearing and repairing areas. That's often one that we find that's kind of counter to some of the management objectives for standards and guidelines, staying out of riparian zones, and then for our area for basketry material. One of the most important ones that I think often fire scientists or managers don't consider, but talking to traditional people, is whether it was around the village, along the trails, or around the camps, you had to have various fuel wood that was gathered. And it was a lot of the ladies' role plus other people's role to gather. When you're gathering all that 10 and 100 and 1,000-hour fuels and breaking off limbs and lemon trees up, you're reducing your fuel continuity around traditional use areas. That's something that's not really thought about when you think about how historically fire was used. If you had also gathered up quite a bit of the surface fuel, how that related to the fire effects within that area. So firewood was an important one. Plus also we have fuel wood management issues today for heating and for the cost of our own energy and expenses in our communities. This one is the patch idea concept. And again, I worked with a guy named Dr. Bob Zyback over in Western Oregon. We had this kind of 3-step idea of describing at the broad level Indian fire use. For patch burning, tribal burning of patches were often smaller in extent and serial stage diversity than lightning ignited areas. And a patch is a specific application of fire or fuels within a bounded area for food maintenance, utility, or travel. And if you look at the example on the right, this is the hillside above a Yurok village taken in 1910 and 1920 there. And you see the prairies, then you see the old growth redwood and Douglas fir forest. You see this mixed hardwood stand, you see the shrub field, you see some grass in between. Not only did each of those different forest types in close proximity provide foods, medicines, and materials for the wildlife there, it also provided a close concentration area for the nesting, foraging, denning, or other requirements. And so as we look at how tribal burning had a system of interlocking mosaics or patches, not only did that afford greater biological diversity, but it also provided greater security for the tribal families that relied upon different resources in close proximity to that hillside spring where you also got your water and also did other things that were in importance of the water there. So just thinking about the interlocking patches, and I think really, and looking at the extent of fires and how fires have changed across the landscape, we've lost a lot of that fine-scale diversity, which I believe, and trying to do with my research, was a legacy of tribal management. Next. Other cases, and looking for broadcast burning, this is along the Redwood National Park area now, but it was between 2 tribal territories. This was considered an international trail between the interior and to the coast. And so different families had different traditional rights to resources, whether it was hunting or gathering roots or berries or acorns off the sides, but also people were allowed to go between territories and even access resources. And so setting fire to the landscape for multiple purposes with general boundaries was also an application of fire use. Next. Again, I bring up the issue of trails, and so some of the work and talking with elders was how important those were. A lot of those trails went from Indian trail to pack trail for early American settlers, that then some of them now are roads. And so we find ourselves on these key features of the landscape, again, a former trail, what's now a road, for a lot of our management objectives and for our management concerns. These were also important ignition locations, and as well as they were fuel breaks because they were more frequently burned. And we saw, at least in my area, in Northern California, or Bill and I's area, was that some of these former Indian trails that were the most ignitable areas across the landscape were also, after the Weeks Act in 1910 with the Forest Service, were also the most easily suppressed areas. And so where you had fire being most frequently used, all of a sudden that was the most easily suppressed, and that's where we saw the most dramatic change. Next. And then another part that's often grappled with from research side of it is, well, Indians couldn't have managed everywhere across the landscape, so define that. And this has been a tough challenge. If you use the oral history information and traditional knowledge of elders, you find that there were specific areas, but there was a range of things from the rivers all the way up to the high country meadows, to the montane meadows. And so often understanding where and how and why tribal people use fire at higher elevation areas kind of gets at some of that discussion around the extent and the specificity of why and how they used fire. And I just had some examples here for us. It was above 3,500 feet, usually above that winter snow line level. Couldn't get up much higher in the snow in the wintertime. But in the summer, if families were up there for a month, there could be a lot of things that were done in the summer that affected those high elevation fire regimes. Next. So how to incorporate traditional knowledge into geographic information system or mapping. I started going back, noticing that a lot of elders talked to these early 1920s or this early transitional time. And so I went, and actually this one elder gave me her original 1928 forest map that had the trails on it. And I had that digitized to show where the trails were at between different resource areas. Started looking at or working with archaeologists and thinking about human pathways or basically foraging where people would go to different burn patches to use resources. And then I really think that this kind of using this historical kind of condition as a baseline helps provide some applications for restoration or conservation and for management today. Another way to look at that, and sorry but these graphics are kind of bad, but basically we overlaid the old trails with the villages and then started looking at some of the fire landscape patterns. And really to look at these additional needs for GIS modeling was to compare historical and ethnographic information with the fire history studies, because again, there was an interlocking relationship between the fire patches and tribal use patterns. Compare site-specific archaeological or tribal land use information with paleoclimate and fire history data. And then really show some examples here is compare to fire history sample points as far as like the distance to the trails or tribal camps and other culturally significant sites as basically being a way to indicate that. So we had Jeff Crawford, graduate student from University of Nevada, Reno, worked with me in the Karuk tribe. We picked 2 low elevation sites. Usually most of the paleoclimate studies are done at high elevation lakes where they assume it's climate signature. But we selected 2 low elevation lakes that were known as cultural use areas. The one here at Fish Lake, another one, Lake Omaramtok, within the parts of the Karuk territory and neighboring the Yurok territory. Next. Essentially, you go out, you collect those fire scars. Each horizontal line is a tree sample. The little tick marks or little lines are a year that it burned. And you can see from about 1870 all the way up to about 1900, there was a frequency, mean fire return interval of 11 years, and then with fire suppression, essentially, fire was missing from that one site. 90% of these fires were late or dormant season. So, was that lightning fire? Was it Indian? But we had a lot of things suggesting that it was Indian burning, and part of sometimes even a small 4-inch diameter tree would even have a scar on it. And then that fire, essentially, that fire use stopped around 1900. Next. If you look across these sites, you compare the charcoal that was taken from the lake cores with the fire frequencies, and essentially just as one line of evidence to look at it. But sometimes what we found between these 2 lake sites, which are very comparable in distance from the river, distance to the villages, that there was actually 2 different fire signatures. One perhaps showing more of a climatic signature because it's a little bit closer to the coast. Another one perhaps showing more of an anthropogenic or tribal fire use. But again, using these different multiple methods to help understand that past fire history for that place. Next. And then just the other area, I won't read all this text, but it was interesting I found for one of the mid to higher elevation fire history studies that were done between a Humboldt State professor and the Six Rivers National Forest, the Forest Service there, was that they came up with the conclusion that these fires were probably ignited by Native Americans burning the culture basket materials, foods, and clothing. And then they said it was a 21 to 86 year overall fire with the mean fire return interval being 36 years. And they said to suppress the fires of the white forest, increase the fuel loads, affect species composition, and stand structure. And additionally, that would increase over what was considered natural conditions. So they considered it natural conditions, but they also acknowledged Indian burning. And at the same time, the heritage or resource people were interviewing tribal people. And I found some ethnographic quotes about the same place that the fire history study was done, not knowing each other within the same Forest Service office that they were doing both the studies, one fire history, one ethnographic, cultural. And essentially this informant said, yeah, trail used to run from that place up to Cedar Camp. And then the Karuk other woman interview person said, yeah, brush was burned around there to bring back the deer. And so it's interesting how sometimes you can get multiple information for the same site of interest to have better information. Next. And then for my research, when working with the basket weavers and other tribal practitioners, really, how do I devise an experiment or a research study? And so sometimes thinking about the plot, other stand level observational or manipulative experiments, what's my sampling size or what's my methods? Am I finding to work with a basket weaver what maybe an ecologist would consider to measure is different from a tribal practitioner would consider measuring, and so you have to bring those things in line. And so an example for this one, for the hazel, it was important to the basket weaver that there's good long slender shoots, where if I just took the standard ecological approach, it would be, oh, that there was so much crown area, or there would be the density of this plant. Just because the plant's present doesn't mean necessarily it's serving or providing the cultural function and role that it needs to. And so by working with tribal practitioners, you can modify or even tailor your ecological sampling for fire effects monitoring to meet the needs, so that way what you find out is applicable back to the community. And then the byproduct of the research for doing these prescribed burns was the good basket material that then helped me understand how that shrub burned at this time of year, like in the fall, harvested 17 months later, burned in like October, harvested the following 2 Mays later, would lead to this size basket stick that would go for that type of basket. Whether it's the acorn basket in the middle or the jump dance basket, which was used for the World Renewal ceremony, I now understand, and you look at how fine that basket work is, I now understand at the shrub level and at the plot level and at the stand for diversity of these shrubs, how important it takes to have 1,000 basket sticks of all the same size, how many acres or how many area I need to treat to even produce that one basket. Without correlating that, just because it burns doesn't mean that necessarily that fire would serve all the cultural purposes needed to bring back that, to make a basket for that ceremony. Water is very important. I think many of the elders we talk to and work with remind us again and again the sacredness of the water and how fire relates to water yield. And part of that is looking at the springs, streams, and the river corridor, higher elevation areas around the meadows or lakes or ponds, and thinking about these different places. And then the fire science or fire ecology with the fire histories would tell us that there's differences perhaps in fire return intervals, but even for the high elevation areas, the tribal people were burning in the late fall after they were done hunting deer and elk and smoking that meat and gathering huckleberries and gathering root resources. They would burn out those meadows before they left, just as the first snow was starting to come down, and they would head down the trail. Well, if you don't know that context of that meadow being used as an important cultural camp for generations, you would assume that was lightning fire. Or as I showed in the other picture, those boundaries between the adjacent forest and the meadow, those were fine ecotonal edges that were maintained in many places by cultural burning for specific resource objectives. And then another concept of tying the fire to the water. After actually I worked on as a resource advisor in 2008 fire, I went to go help as a fish packer for subsistence fishing, and noticed that under the inversion, because the sunlight is reflected back, the air temperature is cooler, the rivers cool down, which otherwise would have been like a 100-degree day. It's now 60 degrees, and it's basically under the inversion that the fish were moving. The juvenile fish were leaving the cold water refugia of the creeks and headed downstream, and adult fall chinook were moving up. And so I started working with the traditional practitioners, the fishermen, saying, well, what is it about the smoke that when it cools off the river, it triggers the fish to move? They're like, oh, yeah, it does. So I started trying to put the science behind that, and then worked with the Karuk tribe and the fisheries that had this telemetry data where they were looking at the juvenile coho that they had for mark recapture, and we were basically seeing that the red line shows you how hot it would be with high temperatures under a normal summer without fire, but when it had its smoke, it basically brought that critically high temperature down lower, and it made the fish more resilient. And plus also because of reduced evapotranspiration under the inversion, which is about 3,500 feet or lower, the stomatal conductance, a little technical here, but basically the fine particulate smoke of basically that smoldery skunking around basically affects the stomata of the hardwoods and the conifers. They really can't even suck up water. They can't physically photosynthesize, plus they have reduced sunlight. So if they're not sucking up water, that means there's an increased spring flow, and you see a little bit of a difference at the creek mouths cumulatively. If you think about refugia along that river conductivity, where normally it's a thermal barrier to salmon migration, and now the smoke-induced change makes it easier for salmon juveniles to head out and for adults to move up, that's a smoke-induced change. And these are concepts that, at least for me, were taught from my grandfather and others about linking the Creator's gift of fire to the trees, to the water, to the springs, to the fish. But it took me to science to kind of help put that story together. Next. And so how do different data sources and traditional knowledge help with restoration? We have to look at our applicable scientific methods and what's available data. I think TEK can help fire managers and ecologists with understanding the historical application of fire by tribal people, defining some of the frequencies, the intensity, and the application of fire in different areas or habitats. And it can also provide alternative or additional information to infer and also inform different scientific disciplines. And so in the case of the Klamath tribe here, if you just went and did a fire history study there and you looked at those pines and said, oh, this was the frequency there, but you didn't talk to tribal people that they were there picking huckleberries and hunting elk, and they burned around their camps after they were done, you would only think that was a natural fire regime, but not necessarily the cultural fire regime. Next. And so I think this is where we're going to change over for Bill to talk about some of these, right? No more? Okay. So involving TEK with restoration practices, this was a burn done 2 Octobers ago right behind my house on my neighbor's property. That top picture there, you can't really see it, but my house is in the back there. Essentially, we're looking at, fall burning. Well, for the cultural indicator for us, it's the change from the infertile and buggy acorns to the time when the good acorns start to drop. And when you're looking at that first fall of rain and that change in the surface fuel humidity or the surface fuel moisture, you basically want to burn right at that transition from buggy acorns to the good acorns, which are white top good. And when we caught that window, all the preceding acorns that fell were white top good, were the good ones. That burned out the bugs that would normally, the filbert weevil and moth, that would normally infect the next good crop falling on the ground. So for a fire manager working and how do we adapt to changing conditions over intergenerational context, it's that specificity to a specific resource, just not the season, but the intention, even their ignition pattern, and having that smolder over the night to fumigate the canopy for any of those other bugs that would like to come down and infect acorns. That was an important objective that we were able to achieve. I gathered acorns here with my family, and that went back to supporting the ceremonies and other things in the community as part of this community research prescribed burn. Next.
Yeah, and in addition on that last slide, there's the whole duff layer didn't even burn, and so you didn't get into interfering with the mycelium interactions, and then at night we're kind of thinking that because part of the practice was intentionally to smoke the trees, and so. But we're thinking that just learning more about the life cycle of the insect, that it's the fire that treats the insect, but the smoke and the heat and the canopy overnight as it's held down probably has a lot more to do with pathogens and molds and stuff like that. So what I see today in a lot of cases is opposite of what I was raised to observe and believe. Human use seems to have become a factor of ecological diminishment rather than a process of holistic balance. We put fires out instead of lighting them. We target timber as our most valued resource instead of just another byproduct of our collective actions. And we're responding to invasives with an eye towards sanitation instead of prevention. As a result, our actions have a singular focus, and we're losing entire species populations. Human intervention is the only way to expedite a reversal of this trend. Social factors can be difficult to bridge, especially when they're driven by economics. But when you make ecological viability the driver in achieving social and economic vitality, you establish dependency on a healthy ecosystem in correlation with your level of community adaptation to fire as a component of its associated processes and functions. Indigenous practices complement natural phenomena in support of human use within a range of improvement generated by correlating actions and activities. Though this may seem simple, it is quite complex. The range of improvement for maintaining hazel production may seem to be limited to weaving sticks and nuts, but it extends to maintaining oak woodlands, which promote healthy porcupine populations, which help maintain patch dynamics, which promote food web diversity for both humans and animals alike. All of these contribute to changing the perception of fire from a threat to a benefit if properly guided by humans before damaging thresholds are reached within the historic fire return interval. So diversity is key. If a particular species is in decline, there can be focused mitigations, but always with an eye towards holistic balance as the solution. If you have an endangered species present, you need to help that species serve its purpose. And in doing so, you will begin to recover that species. You ask yourself what the species does, how that correlates to other species and associated ecological functions, what are the patch condition dynamics that would optimize associated food web interactions, and are there remnant cultural use species in these patches that can help guide beneficial management practices within its habitat. Then you research and monitor species and ecosystem response to your treatment, identify areas of improvement, adapt the practice, revisit response, and so on. This is how TEK is constructed. It is a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief passed down through many generations. It is cumulative and dynamic. It builds upon experience and adapts to change. If this can be revitalized as an integral part of local culture at the community scale, then it can inspire others, spread from community to community, and humans can once again serve their rightful place as a critical ecosystem component.
I guess just in closing, go back one slide, please. I at least want to acknowledge, you've seen this woman, Laverne Ferris Glaze. She's been in a lot of my pictures. She was my community forestry research partner, and I still continue to work with her and really thank her and her family for a lot she's taught, as well as other elders. Didn't really say at the beginning because we transitioned, but I wanted to acknowledge the elders here, the tribe, the college, and the drum, because all that came together to welcome us here, and so thank you. Yotwa.
Yeah, it's I guess there's a few things I didn't really discuss in the presentation that I've been learning over the past few days and working with the master's student and doing her thesis on the spiritual aspects of fire, and speaking to some people that are bringing back some ceremonies and stuff, and some of these ties aren't only just to the land that you're looking at. You know, it relates to the sun and the moon and the stars as well, and you know, there's our June-July moon is the name actually means time of the fire, and I was always told that when the birds come back to nest, it's time to stop burning, and so it's kind of interesting that some of this information is coming back around to us. That even goes so far as to when Pleiades is not visible in the sky, then those spirits have come back to help us bring people together in the dance, and that's really the only time when fire isn't used in our culture other than for heating and cooking, and that's also reflected in the ceremony. It's those early spring ceremonies of the flower dance for women coming of age. The fire isn't the central part of that. It's behind you for heat. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. And
You guys want to just stay up here for a minute? And,
Okay.
I mean, you covered a lot of really interesting ground there, and people have some thoughts, reactions, something that stirred you to take notes.
Sure. I'm going to pass this around, or I'll restate the question.
No, I just tend to agree that what we've been talking about is incorporating TEK and resource management, and there's a lot of literature out there that you know kind of describes how and why and where. But you know, as you mentioned at the tail end there, there's the information or the reason. I mean, there's a deeper reasoning behind why we should incorporate TEK into our land management scenarios, and it's based on the deeper spiritual understanding and the ceremony behind the use of fire. So I know you just touched on it at the end, but I totally agree that, you know, what we know is probably just a thin layer of why and who and what was the ceremony behind, you know, the things that we see now.
You wanna talk to that anymore? Here, use this thing.
Yeah, I know that there's probably a lot of information that's still needs to be collected in a lot of areas. I know that we were kind of fortunate to be one of the last tribes contacted in the lower 48, and so a lot of these things were still happening, you know, 70 years ago. People get shot for it, but they were still doing it. And so it's, you know, the ceremonies were kind of carried on in secrecy, and there was a lot of knowledge that was actually captured in a lot of the books from Kroeber and a whole bunch of these other anthropologists that's kind of helped to bring a lot of it back into light for us. It's one of those important things, you know, that there is a deeper meaning behind it all, and the more pieces of this puzzle we can put back together, the better. But I think it can be done in large, or it could be done everywhere. I mean, we learn from the animals. We can learn from the animals again. We just have to learn how to let them talk to us.
And I think, again, as a researcher, going back through and looking at ethnographic information or talking to elders and then thinking about, well, they made this observation between the stars and this ceremony and when they were burning, you know, how is that informative to a fire manager? If that was in most the part that guided the time that you burned, and now we're trying to burn in spring because there's less liability and we have better, you know, safer burning conditions, then we have to think about the interplay and the trade-offs between trying to meet modern management objectives versus this ancestral use of fire and those broader cosmological or spiritual things that guided fire use that had ecological as well as cultural implications. And so I think for managers or for scientists working at tribes, you may not have to understand the spiritual perspectives, you may not have to even be involved in ceremonies, but respect that and know that, okay, if they're saying this is what guides it, then what can you do in your treatment strategies to reunite and realign and revive that part of your fuels and fire management in line with that traditional practice that's guided from their sacred use of fire. Yes, Elder.
Lemons. My name is Louis Adams, and I'm a Salish Indian. My ancestry is from the Bitterroot. Now, when I was growing up, I used to hear a lot of our people, the old people, used to say, the four things our Indians always believed in. Of course, is number one, Kunsutan. Number two, Studio. Salish didn't have a Mother Earth or Father Sun or Uncle Stars. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying what I'm speaking for the Salish. Number three was the Sweat Lodge. That's how we communicated with him up there. That was along all the lakes, along all the streams, along anywhere Indians camped, there was a sweat lodge. I found this out. I went up to Big Hole where Chief Joseph was caught up to, and I found evidence there of sweat lodges. Nobody else probably looked for that, but I did. Then number four, Suwetchum, lightning, because the old Indians used to say, when he cleans house, he uses fire. And that's the way it's always been. We didn't have to, because my grandparents used to say, sometimes, you know how smoky it was around here this summer. Sometimes it was like that all the time. There, the big prairie where my grandpa used to spend a lot of times up in, which is now the Bob Marshall Woodlands area. That's like Olev to us. They said sometimes it'd be smoky all summer long. That's why they had to find places to camp where they wouldn't be trapped. But that was our people's belief. You didn't have to make fires anymore. Yeah, I can see when I was seeing this along the coastal tribes and along the, maybe at the Great Lakes or somewhere where it's always wet. Yeah, I can understand that. But our people in the Salish, they didn't build fires. They didn't leave their hunting camps in the fall and throw matches all the different directions. No. They depended on him and lightning. Lemna.
Thank you, and that's a good reminder that, you know, for just not broadly saying all tribes did it in this way, but, you know, again, I touched upon that at the beginning, was that you have that adaptation to the natural conditions and the biophysical, and lightning had its role. And for other places, you know, tribes use fire in different ways, and so it's good to find out that local information and knowledge about it. Anyone add? Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. You're from California, right?
Yeah.
You guys got preservation up there?
Environmentalists, like,
Preservation, I see we got on this reservation, we got preservation. And I was looking at your pictures there, and you said there were some sacred grounds.
yeah.
Usually we send a preservation up there
Okay.
to see if it's, if you could go in there and burn or make highways or whatever it is, So I'd like to find out if you guys got preservation up there to check out before you go up there to whatever,
So, yeah, oh, go ahead and take that one, talk about heritage and typo.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have a land base as people would define it today. It's mostly national forest around us, and so all of the federal laws kind of help us to protect what needs to be protected, but the parts that we're trying to bring back are the human components of human responsibility. And I know a lot of times, when there's projects, you do have to, do things under the National Historic Preservation Act. Well, a lot of times the agencies see that as artifacts and buildings and different things like that, evidence that people can see. But to us, it's a lot more than that. What we want to preserve is a living culture, not just protect it and preserve it as historical information. And so one of the things that, there was a picture of Offield Mountain up there, and that's those places up there where they're transformed in there. Some of the Crayavs transformed into Matamui and Satamui. It's a little upper and lower place there. And we used to roll logs off of there on the new moon in September every year to bring in the new year. It was the final action of the world renewal ceremonies for the year, to singe the hair and remind us through symbolism and then observation why we're supposed to do this. And so there's the way we're trying to approach preservation is not just with the sites. If it's to kind of go beyond that.
And I guess one part for me too, as serving as a resource advisor and working with Bill as the designated tribal representative on those fires, is that we had agency archaeologists that were basically either local or brought in as resources, and they were taught somewhat about the local material culture. But then we also had quite a few different tribal members that were working with elders as heritage resource consultants or like tribal resource advisors. And I found that, a lot of these younger people, having grown up even on a reservation in our rural area, don't necessarily know how to see or how to look for things. There's been a disconnect there. And, just besides the standard stuff of like using the radio and reading the compass, it's even when you're walking through a place, it's like, oh, we're a short ways from that spring, we're on a flat, there's a good breezy place here with a good view if it wasn't all grown up in trees and brush now, and there's likely going to be something here. And so even kind of in that role as a resource advisor and using the fire management agreements between the tribes and the agency, that was one way to not only revive traditional knowledge, but also have elders share with these younger people that were then going out on the fire line what to look for, what's the best way to protect those sites. And sometimes if you'd see, like in our case for acorns, a pestle, you know, if you were going to save that pestle as an artifact, but then for the fire line cut down all those acorn trees, you're going to cut down the orchard and save the old tool. It didn't really make sense. And so sometimes it was having a training on both ways for the fire incident management team and also the local tribal people there that were trying to relearn the culture in the context of place and ecology, how to see it, what to look for, and understand those past uses. And for those values today, we need to do certain treatments so we can bring that back as an important food resource that's benefited from good fire use.
Well, you know, like, I was curious about your consultation. If you're using, you know, non-indigenous archaeologists, are they consulting with the local tribes, even if you don't have a land base that you have, it seems like, so. Can you repeat?
Yeah, so the question is, for the tribal consultation process, yeah, so, you know, I could talk more about this, you know, later, but like with the WFTS program and how to identify values at risk, you know, even for that, for the tribe to identify what they want to have identified in the different protection areas, is getting that information to the agency archaeologists, or if there's somebody who's a non-tribal person who works for the tribe in that heritage program, getting them to understand that. And so there's different levels in which that information is brought in. But there's a formal tribal consultation process, but then at the time of the incident or even for prescribed burning, during that pre-planning, looking and identifying what those resources might be. In some cases, the best thing isn't the flag and avoid. The best thing might actually be to get fire through there to rejuvenate that area.
And then just another question too, when you guys, when you have these sites that you find, are you keeping them strictly on a tribal register or are you putting them on the state register as well?
You guys want to talk about how you identified that? So the question was, when they find a new site, do you follow the agency's protocol for site identification and site form, or is there a different way it's handled through the tribe value? I'll let him answer that.
That can become quite a contentious issue. Some people don't want them recorded, and some people do. You know, we've recently got a TIPO office established, a Tribal Heritage Preservation Officer. So we've been trying to build it into our Ecocultural Resources Management Plan, a process for maintaining that information in the tribe. I know that, you know, on the fires we have, in 1994 we got an MOU established with the Forest Service for expedited consultation on these fires, and so the tribal council delegates a designated tribal government representative, and then we have heritage consultant coordinators and heritage consultants, all that have knowledge about specific place, that are sent out with the archaeologists. And a lot of times on the fires we don't record. We just go out there and we say, put the line here instead of here, and don't even necessarily tell people what it is. We have identified what things were before, and it only takes one individual to go chip a pear seed off the top of a mountain, and that has happened. And so it's kind of disturbing. It's almost like, why are you even out there? But just being out there actually might have triggered that bad thing to happen. But so yeah, it is important for us to try to keep that knowledge of the sacred, the specifics withheld to the greatest extent possible. But for some things, we have to put some level of information out there just so people can understand, and help us, you know, get to where we need to be.
Do you have time for one more question? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, to what extent does climate change affect your efforts to connect traditional knowledge with modern management practices? Traditional knowledge based on seasonal cues that are now happening at different times of the year. Spring cues that were happening migrations happening at different times.
So how does the changing climate and the current traditional knowledge, how does those observations and experience inform us how we might have adaptive strategies to deal with climate change, and particularly how fire and how we relate to that? Is that part of it? You know, it's kind of a moving window, you know, just like we've had coupled within a couple generations, fire exclusion and suppression, ending of a lot of different cultural practices. So I found in my work as a researcher, trying to gain traditional knowledge as information to help us for climate change adaptation and planning, is to take the known of what they see as an observation or an outcome, cause and effect, and to say, if we see that likely to increase, this is what we can experience. And so, you know, I work closely with the Karuk tribe and others trying to document that, and you really have to have a pulse or a really good indication for those tribal practitioners on the ground. When people are going out to gather huckleberries and the huckleberries are dried up or they're not even there, it's like, well, was that because we had an unusual spring, early summer thunderstorm or something that caused the pollinators not to have so many flower, or, you know, knock off all the flower petals? Is it because we had an extended drought that basically the huckleberries didn't develop? You know, there's different indicators, whether it's certain timing of birds or a certain flowering of things that I think are important to tie those tribal observations and their understanding of the cause and effect, and then try to link what's known with the science. The other challenge I find is downscaling regional climate models that have applicability to culturally significant habitats or areas that mean something to help inform the tribes or tribal practitioners or gatherers to say, hey, this is what we're expecting. If this was the scenario, what would you recommend for our adaptive strategy? How would you treat this area different, or what would you think should be done differently here? Climate change in TK?
Yeah, one of the things that's coming about in that all that climate change projections is that in our area in particular, the thing that's the change that seems to be prominent in the modeling anyway is an increase in frequency and severity of fire. And so it's, you know, fire is an integral part of our particular responsibility to our relations, and so we kind of see that as it's, you know, here it is coming back around, reminding us that we need to get back in there and do it again. And you know, and that's why, you know, we have barriers that we have to overcome in that. You know, I mean, we have a spotted owl closure on February 15th. Well, you know, I mean, we're supposed to get our last two burns, our last 2 weeks of burning in February, before those birds come back to nest, and before all the flowers and everything start coming back. And so it's you know, if that happens to be later in February in a particular year, you know, we can't do it. And so we need to try to bring back our ecological indicators or these natural cues. So maybe, you know, the birds would respond to that change in seasonality. And so if we can bring back our traditional indicators, it wouldn't matter if things happen earlier or later. You still have those cues that tell you when other things are going to begin to happen. And then, you know, and then you can maintain, you know, maybe climate will change so much to where some species will go away or move around slope or whatever, but you have to start getting ahead of it, so you can, you know, maintain the viability of that species on the landscape.
And in some of my work with the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, I think those LCCs are doing a good job of reaching out to tribes. And so, you know, I just put a plug in for them because I sit on the Science TEK committee for the North Pacific one, and I think they're making the effort and trying to find out what are the tribes' researchable questions or issues, climate change issues, what are the researchable questions, and then seek the funding through the consortium of different entities to fund those things. And I know the Karuk tribe got one of those grants funded, so, you know, there's efforts that way being made. They're willing to listen to what's happening on the ground. So, done? Thank you very much. Bill and I will be around. We're also doing a workshop tomorrow on prescribed fire and looking at how to get fire on the ground and the funding and different authorities, and looking for suggestions on how to strengthen that for living cultural resources and fire use to perpetuate and sustain culture. Thank you.